Nathaniel Cole. Rain tasted like cold metal on the glass. He stood under the gleam of a flickering lamp, collar turned up, hands shoved deep into gloves that had never known the warmth of small palms. The suit he wore fit like a promise. It was a promise he did not intend to keep. He had been called many things across boardrooms and private jets. Efficient, decisive, unyielding. Tonight he was only a man in the middle of the city, with a phone that never stopped asking for things he no longer wanted to give. He noticed her because she was human and wrong in his world. She sat on the curb under one umbrella that did not belong to her, somehow trying, with both arms, to cradle the kind of small silence that only babies can have. Her hair was tangled and dark with rain. The baby wore a thin blanket, soaked at the edges, but alive and slow-breathing, like a fragile machine that had been wounded carefully by a hand with patience. Nathaniel, she is young, he told himself. She is not like the others who clustered under awnings and hurried by like specters. He felt something like a tug that was not profit and not propriety. Woman, excuse me, sir, she said, her voice a thread. Do you have change for a bus? Do you have shelter? Nathaniel, shelter is a euphemism in my world. He answered, because answering was simpler than turning away. He paid for an impressive car. The driver around him was a man who had never seen a night like this one. Glass rose, headlights flashed. The city blurred. In the car, the heat was calibrated to the exact degree of comfort that spoke of boardrooms and negotiations. Nathaniel's hands were steady. He had been raised on steadiness. Woman, she clung to hope like a secret. She did not tell him her name. Her eyes were the color of old coins, small and stubborn. She looked at him as if he were a doorway. Nathaniel, you should not stay here. This is not a place for you or your child. Woman, I have nowhere, she said. I have only this night, and maybe a tomorrow. That is too tired to wake. Nathaniel, he would have left if the wind had not whispered a memory of his sister, of a small boy with a scraped knee who had needed someone to insist that he be tended to. He would have left if the baby had not made that small, human sound that turned strangers into witnesses. They went to a restaurant that would have otherwise never had him. He chose a corner with glass that watched the rain and the city. The waiter assumed the suit would order something the menu could not name. The woman asked for the cheapest tea. Nathaniel, he did not always listen to the rules he wrote for others. He had a ledger of compromises and a safe for regrets, though the safe had never been opened. He asked her name as if the syllables could be purchased. Woman, some names are heavy, she said. She said Anna. He said Nathaniel. He said his surname, and it sounded like a title. Conversation was a shelter he had not planned to build. They talked. She told stories that were both too large for the small table and too small for the street. She had lost an apartment, then a job, then a family photograph album with birthdays and the logic that made life make sense. The baby was hers. She laughed once, a short sound that was part apology and part defiance. Nathaniel, I own things, he said. Things are useful. He offered money. She refused with a polite honesty that betrayed desperation. She needed more than money. She needed a place that had walls and a key and a mailbox. She needed someone who could make the system bend. Nathaniel, he surprised himself by deciding to bend it. He had rooms in properties that knew his footsteps by pattern. He had a townhome that was more museum than home, but it was private, and had a bath that was wide enough to hold the rain if one wished it. He arranged for a social worker. He signed a check in a way that made people take breath away. He arranged for clothes, for supplies, for a folder with contact numbers written in decisive ink. Woman, she took the folder, and her hand shook. I am used to being told to leave by 10, she said. Even apartments had exit times in her life. Nathaniel, he laughed at that, a rare sound. He told her there was no exit time in his spaces. His spaces had codes and cameras and service people who would ring bells. He told her he would keep watch if she would let him. In the days that followed, he learned names for things he had never named. There were meetings about trust funds and fiduciaries, and there were also nights where he sat on a couch in an apartment that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and borrowed blankets, and he fed the baby with a bottle he had learned to prepare. The baby, when it smiled, made a crack in Nathaniel's armor. Colleagues, he returned with a softness that worried the board. They asked if a philanthropic tie-in would be efficient. He had to explain that this was not an investment. It was not a statistical return. It was a human being who had placed a small life in his hands. Nathaniel, he found himself inventing problems for his assistants so they would leave him alone. He took the baby to doctor appointments. He learned to fold tiny clothes and to make small things warm. He bought books that had pictures of animals the baby liked. He read as if the language itself had a promise inside. One night, Rain returned with the tenacity of memory. Anna came to him and said, "I have to tell you what happened. I cannot keep secrets in a house that is not truly mine." Nathaniel, he was braced for the word addiction, for shame, for the story that would make him feel like a rescuer rather than an equal. He listened, instead, to a story of mistakes and courage. She had been evicted because a landlord feared the presence of her child. She had been turned away from shelters that could not take infants. She had been robbed of a small ring that meant nothing to the outside and everything to her. "Anna, people say keep hope," she said. "They say it as if hope is a coin. That can be spent. I have spent hope and have only the thing left that fits in my lap." Nathaniel, he felt the distance between them shrink until it was nothing but a line of things to be handled. He wanted to make certainty for a life that had only uncertainty. He wanted to rewrite policies with his signature. He met with people who made policies. He discovered that paper could be soft or razor sharp. He found loopholes and then he closed them. He was precise. He was a man who could harness bureaucracy the way others harnessed horses. The law folded, blinked, and sometimes, like a tired animal, yielded. Anna, there were nights she could not sleep. She watched the baby asleep and listened to the city breathe. She found the way Nathaniel watched the baby strange. Sometimes his eyes were gentle in ways that made her fear him, and sometimes his gentleness scared her into thinking it might not last. Nathaniel, he had built his life on certainty. He had learned to keep everything at the edge of the map. Holding something so delicate taught him patience. It taught him how to wait without the sharp edges of command. There were missteps. Once he brought a woman from work who meant well and said the wrong thing. She asked if the child was a charity case. The words were a stone. Anna's face folded and she retreated into a silence that had corners. Nathaniel learned quickly that kindness could be clumsy. "Anna, I do not want pity," she said. "I want a livelihood." "Nathaniel, then give it to her," he said to himself and to those who listened. He arranged training and interviews. He used his connections in small, quiet ways that did not appear on his philanthropic report. A man called Marcus. Marcus was a former employee who had also been something like a friend. He did not understand why Nathaniel had changed his calendar to include baby checkups and school fairs. He said to Nathaniel, "You are wasting your time." Nathaniel listened. "Marcus, time is a currency," he said. "Spend it wisely." "Nathaniel, I am spending it well," Nathaniel said. But he knew the board would never approve of some ledger entries. He also knew some things did not fit in ledgers. He paid for Anna's training and accepted the rage that came from it. Rage that had been stored like winter wood in her bones. Rage that sometimes flared into sharp words. Anna, she wanted to thank him with everything she had. She brought him a painting made from coffee grounds and the edge of a newspaper. She insisted he keep it because it was the only thing she could offer that was not serviceable by check. Nathaniel, he put the painting on a mantle he rarely used. He changed a frame to fit it and found that the texture of coffee stain looked like a small map of a life in pieces. He found himself noticing the tilt of a smile and the sound of a baby reaching for a finger. On a day when winter was still only a promise and the baby was studying, to find the word funnier than frightening, Anna received a letter. It was a short note with a stamp and an emblem she had not seen in years. It said that a woman who had been her neighbor was willing to testify about her character. It said that someone had left a folded envelope in a mailbox and that small kindnesses added up. Nathaniel, he watched Anna open that envelope like someone watching a tiny miracle. She read, and then she cried quietly, a sound that was both relief and the memory of grief. He realized that the money he had given and the contacts he had used were threads in a net that could hold her. He also realized that some nets were woven of other people's small, unseen acts. "Anna, you have given me steadiness," she said one night as the baby slept in a nest of blankets. Steadiness is not always something you buy. Sometimes people give it because they cannot explain why. Nathaniel, he did not know how to receive words. He had been a giver in the language of contracts. Now he received with a greed that was quiet and new. They built routines together. Sometimes it was awkward. Nathaniel learned to pack lunches that did not look like corporate briefcases. He learned to wake early and to make porridge without checking a spreadsheet. He learned the names of lullabies and found that humming could be a negotiation of a different sort. There were tests. The world kept asking for receipts. He had to prove that his help was not an attempt to control. He might have been wrong. He had to prove that he was not using resources to bind someone to him. The social worker asked questions that cut through both their hands. Social worker, how will you maintain independence? Who will be the primary caregiver? These were practical questions that felt like a cross-examination. Nathaniel and Anna answered in fits and starts because some answers belonged to the future. Nathaniel, he wanted to declare that nothing would ever part them, which would have been melodramatic and wrong. He wanted to give her choices because he had learned what it meant to have none. Anna, one afternoon an old man knocked on the door. He was the one who had met Anna years ago and had been a quiet protector from the other side of the street. He had seen her fall and he had seen her try. He offered a small job that would not pay much, but would give her hours and a reason to stand. Nathaniel, small jobs can be openings. He watched Anna take the job like she was stepping onto a bridge. He watched the baby learn to recognize a rhythm of coming home. He watched her shoulders stop carrying storms. There were setbacks. A neighbor complained. A landlord was suspicious of too many names on a door. The baby got sick with a fever that demanded a hospital visit. He drove through rain with a child's fever cradled in his hands and he felt something like terror that was not about stock options. Anna. She called him by his first name once when she thought he would not hear. Nathaniel. She breathed, and the word made him feel like a person and a thing all at once. It was not just a name. It was an acknowledgement. Nathaniel, he had to reconcile who he had been with who he was becoming. There were days his old life clashed with the new. Board meetings that lasted hours, contracts to sign, flights to catch. He would leave and return with souvenirs of business dinners and with apologies that sometimes sounded like rehearsed lines. Anna, forgiveness is a practice, she said. It is not always instant. She taught him how to ask for it properly. They argued sometimes. Love is not a straight line. There were moments the scale tipped and the balance was in question. Nathaniel could be cold and Anna could be volatile. But they always came back to the baby, who was small and honest and had no stake in the arguments that adults loved for the sound they made. Baby, the baby learned to clap and to say small noises that hinted at language. The house grew with the sound of toys. Nathaniel bought a small wooden train and had the ridiculous pleasure of pushing it across a floor that echoed like a heart. Then one evening, a man arrived who introduced himself as the father of the child that Anna had once known in a past life. He had been absent, and now he wanted a role. He spoke of rights and shared custody and of mistakes he would undo. Nathaniel listened and felt a landscape shift. Nathaniel, he could have fought. He could have resisted. He could have used money and influence to keep what he had built. He chose instead to hold to a principle he had learned somewhere between one board meeting and another. That belonging was not ownership. He met the man in a cafe that smelled of beans and rain. The man had lines of regret written on his face. He was not a villain. He was tired and awkward. He wanted to be better. Man, I want to be a father, he said. It was a small sentence that carried a lot of fear. Nathaniel, he could have declared himself dispensable. He could have been dramatic, he did not. He offered instead a contract of support and an invitation to accountability. He used his access to create a structure in which the man could prove himself. Anna, the man tried. He showed up late sometimes, and on time other times. He hesitated in ways that cost precious days. It hurt. It delighted. Life became a complicated weave of small decisions. Nathaniel, he discovered that the truest measure of his change was not in the press releases he never wrote, but in how he felt when the man carried the baby down a hallway for the first time. He felt relief and also something like loss. He was learning that love could be generous in ways that did not diminish him. They continued. Seasons shifted. Nathaniel's colleagues began to accept a version of him that made room for something messy. He had to guard against the easy narrative that he was a hero. He refused the applause that might turn into currency. Instead, he focused on chores and on being present and on the small, ordinary acts that make a life. One spring he took Anna to a park that had trees that were older than his city plans. They walked, and the baby toddled, and they let the sun be accidental and warm. They sat on a bench that smelled like older wood and new leaves. Anna, she took his hand. "You changed my life," she said. It felt like a line taken out of a book. He smiled and told her that she had changed his. Nathaniel, he said he had been cold to survive. He had been taught that detachment was strength. He had been wrong. He had learned that warmth can be an instrument of courage. Anna, they both learned to be small in public and large in private. They were deliberate in making plans that would hold the baby, and in making agreements that would give Anna independence. Nathaniel, his company launched a program that helped single parents in precarious situations. He made sure it was run by those with lived experience. He was careful to avoid the self-congratulatory shine that some initiatives wore. He insisted that the program be accountable and generous. There were moments of tenderness that could not be scheduled. Once he stood in a kitchen as Dawn lit a kettle and Anna prepared breakfast. The baby was between them like a small island. He felt no plan in that moment, and that lack of purpose felt full and right. Anna, they found friends in odd places. Marcus, who had doubted him, admitted that what Nathaniel had done made him think differently. The social worker who had interviewed them both came to tea and cried when she saw the baby sleep peacefully in a crib that used to be a stranger's house. Nathaniel, he had not cured the world, but he had altered a life. He had moved a fragile human being from the street into safety, and then given that human being the chance to stand. He had learned to stay, even when staying was messy. One night the city had a storm, so loud it seemed to speak in another language. The power flickered, and the baby woke frightened. Nathaniel held the child and felt the world outside as if through a film. For the first time in a long time he had no meetings to attend. He simply sat and hummed, and the sound seemed to glue the edges of the night together. Anna, she looked at him, and then at the baby, and then back at him. "Thank you," she said, and it was not a sentence limited to money or shelter. It was a sentence about steadiness, about the work of showing up. Nathaniel, he answered with a soft laugh, and then with a promise he did not need to sign. "I will be here," he said. Time moved because it must. The child learned names and songs and started to run. They argued less and found a rhythm that did not require speeches or reports. Nathaniel found that being present could be more difficult than closing a deal. It required honesty and repetition, and the courage to be ordinary. Anna, years later they would stand at a small graduation of sorts. It would be a day with paper hats and applause that meant everything. The baby, now a child, would look out to the world and find a path that had once been invisible. Nathaniel, he would still sometimes stand by a window and watch rain fall and remember the first night when a woman had been sitting under an umbrella with a child. He would remember the ache that made him cross the street. Anna, she would keep a small journal. In it she would write lines about small mercies and the men and women who had seen her. She would write about how she had been given the chance to be steady and how she had learned to be steady for herself. Nathaniel, he would accept the title of guardian of a different sort. He would learn to measure success not by profit margins, but by the small lives who had more of a chance than before. They would not be perfect. They would have scars and entries and ledgers that were messy and nights when the old world pressed in. But they had built a life that honored the small promise that had started it all, that when someone sits under the rain with a baby in their lap, there is a person somewhere who notices and decides to change the geometry of their life to make space. The rain still fell sometimes, and Nathaniel still watched it, but it no longer tasted like cold metal when he stood there. It tasted like an old hymn that he was learning the words to.